Hilchos Mechusrei Kaparah Perek Shlishi, the laws of the sacrifices of those who are lacking atonement. That means that the sacrifice is the final stage of their purification process, chapter 3. Today we're continuing the topic of the Zav. The Zav is a man who has an abnormal discharge from his reproductive organ. Yesterday we talked about how to become a Zav, and that's by having 2 or more sightings of this irregular discharge. If you only have one, you're what's called a Balkari, you're equivalent to somebody who had a regular seminal emission, different levels of ritual impurity, not the one that we're talking about now. A Zav, you have to have 2 sightings. If you have 3 sightings, you become a Zav Gomor, a complete Zav, who has to then also bring a sacrifice to complete his purification process. That's the guy that we're really occupied with in this set of laws. And yesterday the Rambam was talking about how to become a Zav, the different conditions that have to be met in order for the sightings to be considered a regular sighting, and how do we establish if there's 2 sightings or 3 sightings, etc. Today the Rambam talks about how to get out of the state of being a Zav and all the obstacles that can get into the way when the Zav is trying to become pure. The thing to know is that the process for a Zav to emerge from his impurity resembles the process of the Zava, the woman who has an irregular blood flow, and her emergence to purity. That we've already covered in a previous book, in the Rambam's 5th book. And what is that? She has to go through 7 clean days. That means every day after the blood stops, she has to examine herself internally to see that there's no blood. And if for 7 days in a row there's no blood, then she goes to the mikvah on the 7th day, waits till sunset, and on the 8th day she brings a sacrifice. The same exact thing happens for a Zav. When the dripping stops, you count 7 clean days. How do you determine if it's a clean day? By virtue of an internal examination, making sure that the dripping has stopped. On the 7th day goes to the mikvah, and then on the 8th day brings the sacrifices. That's going to be the basic process. And then we're going to see that there are ways to interrupt that process. The same way if a Zava sees blood during the 7 clean days, it disrupts the flow. Same thing if a Zav sees a discharge during his 7 clean days, that disrupts the flow. And that's the laws that we're going to be getting into today. So the Rambam begins, halacha aleph, kol hayamim shehazav reya bahen zivus harehu tameh. All the days during which a Zav is seeing a consistent drip of discharge, he remains impure. Once the dripping stops, and now he wants to go to the way of purity, he needs to count 7 clean days. Just like the Zava, the woman who experienced an irregular blood flow, on the 7th day, in the hopes that it's going to be a good day, he goes to the mikvah. And waits till sunset, and then on the 8th day, he has to bring the sacrifice if he had 3 sightings. Of course, if you only had 2 sightings, all you need is 7 clean days, and then you're good. If you had 3 sightings, you carry the additional obligation of a sacrifice. The sacrifice is always brought the day after the 7 clean days are complete. Says that Rambam, these 7 days must be fully clean. If he sees even 1 sighting of this abnormal discharge, even if it's at the end of the 7th day, after he already went to the mikvah, sasar hakoil, it destroys the entire 7 days that he has counted. And he needs to recount the 7 clean days from after the last day on which he saw the sighting. Halacha Beis, let's consider the following case. Zav Shera Keri. You have a Zav who experienced a regular seminal emission, not any more of the abnormal discharge, a different type of discharge during the 7 clean days, be'echad mishivas yemei hasfira, on one of the 7 days of counting. It does disrupt the flow, but not the whole flow. He only demolishes that day. Umashlim shiva yamim. Afterwards, you simply resume the count of 7 days, complete the 7 days, umevi karbana, and you bring the sacrifice. Ketzad, what's an example of this? Ra keri bayom hachamishi. Yeah, so he's a Zav, and then he begins to count his days. So he counts 4 clean days. Then on the 5th day, he sees a seminal emission. So that day is out. Sefer acharav shleisha yamim. You need 3 days after that to complete the 7 days. The tevel bashlishi on the 3rd day, which is really the 7th day of cleanliness. You go to the mikvah, maybe karbanim baravi, and you bring the sacrifice the next day, the 4th day of the completion days, 8th day overall of cleanliness. Halacha Gimel, we talked about the examinations that the Zav has to do every day. What if he didn't do an examination every day? Zav shabadak b'yem rishon mimei hasfira u'matzah tahar. A Zav checks himself on the 1st day of the counting, he finds himself to be pure. V'loi badak kol shiva, the rest of the 7 days he doesn't check. Uvayem hashvi badak u'matzah tahar, and on the 7th day he does a check and he finds it to be pure. Hareza b'cheskas tahara. Since they're bookended by days of purity, we can presume that everything in between has also been days of purity. Goes even further. Afilu badak b'yem hatuma atzma umatzah tahar. Even if he didn't check on the first clean day, he checked on the day before when he was actually impure, but he found himself to be pure later in the day, upasak hazayv, meaning that the discharge had stopped. So of course the clean day count will begin the next day. But the first examination he did was at the end of the previous day. He didn't count the next day in the beginning of the days of the counting. Ubadak bashvi, and he only checked the second time on the seventh day, or even on the eighth day. And he found himself to be pure, as long as again there's a bookend of purity. All the days in between of counting count. And he is in the presumption of purity. Halacha Dalid, a very, very important rule. Kol ri'iyah shehisei seres. Any sighting whose main purpose is to demolish a previous count, eina mevia lidei karban, cannot become part of another count of sightings, which will ultimately bring a person to be obligated in a sacrifice. What does this mean? The Rambam will describe it. Ketzat. Ra shtei ri'iyos. Let's say a person saw two sightings. So day 1 and 2 were sightings of Zav. That means he becomes a Zav. No sacrifice because he only saw two sightings, but it does require him to count 7 clean days. There was a day or 2 day break. We'll go with the 2 day break. During which he is beginning to count the 7 clean days. Then boom, in the middle of the 7 days, let's call it here the 3rd day, he sees a sighting of Zayf. So of course, what is the sighting going to do now? It's going to demolish the entire count of the clean days. He's going to have to restart the next day. But since the main purpose of this day is to demolish the previous count, this sighting cannot combine with these 2 sightings. It just demolishes. That's all it does. And you recount the 7 clean days as we explained. In other words, even though right now you're still related to these 2 sightings because you're in the middle of counting clean days for the sightings, the fact that you had a 3rd sighting cannot combine to the others and make you obligated in a sacrifice. It goes even further. Even if during the 7 clean days you saw 3 consecutive sightings, one after the other. Even if you saw them all on one day. Even if you saw all 3 at the end of the 7 clean days. So here you are. You had 2 sightings that makes you a Zav. You're counting 7 clean days. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. On the 7th day, you have 3 new consecutive sightings. 3 new consecutive sightings should obligate you to bring a sacrifice. But since you're still in the middle of the 7 clean days for the last set, so all this will do is demolish the count. You don't bring a sacrifice for these, because these sightings only count towards demolishing the previous count, not towards accruing to a new total of sightings to obligate you in a sacrifice. However, what if you saw these 3 sightings, not on day 7, but after day 7 is over, the night going into the 8th day? So now maybe carbon. You will have to bring a sacrifice. Because such sightings will no longer demolish the previous count. 7 clean days are over, so you've taken care of these 2 sightings. And now you're starting anew. These are new sightings. 3 sightings require a sacrifice. Says the Rambam, however, there's a caveat here. When do we say this? If the original way you became a Zav was only by 2 sightings. Because then you were never obligated in a sacrifice. All you had to do was 7 clean days. Those 7 clean days are over. Whatever happens after the 7th day is considered a new count. But let's say you were a Zav who had 3 sightings. So we'll use this same chart. We'll just imagine there was another sighting over here on the Shabbos before. So there's a Shabbos sighting, a Sunday sighting, and a Monday sighting. Now he has 3 days of sightings. That means right here he has to count 7 clean days and bring a sacrifice. So if all goes well, what will happen? He'll count the week. And then on this day, the 8th day here, is when he's going to bring a sacrifice. So technically, he's not done yet with taking care of his first issue. So if this Zav Bal Shalish, if he sees 3 sightings on the night going into the 8th day, after 7 clean days, here, he doesn't have to bring a second sacrifice for these 3 sightings. Only 1 sacrifice for the first 3 sightings. Because even though you can make the same argument, hey, 7 days are over. These are not going to demolish any count. So if the sightings aren't demolishing the count, why shouldn't they count on their own? At this point, the night of the 8th day, this original Zav has never entered a time that he could bring a sacrifice. When are you able to bring a sacrifice? Only on the 8th day. And not just for a technical reason, because you could only bring sacrifices on the day. You actually cannot bring the sacrifice in any way, shape, or form until the daytime. Nighttime is considered lacking of time. It's not as though it's the appropriate time to bring a sacrifice, it's not a technicality, you can't bring it by night. It's not the appropriate time till the morning breaks. So you've never entered a time frame when you're fit to bring a sacrifice. Because nighttime is Mechusrei zman lakol. It's called before the time arrives. Except for one exception, a woman who gave birth to a female, then she has 80 days till she brings a sacrifice on the 81st day. If she miscarries on the night before, the night of the 81st day, she brings a second sacrifice, as we explained. That's a matter learned from tradition, an exception we learned from Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai. But otherwise, usually, if you're bringing a sacrifice on a given day, the night before you're still lacking. You haven't entered a time frame fit to bring a sacrifice yet, and therefore you're not done yet taking care of the first sacrifice. And these 3 sightings, therefore, cannot begin a new count. Halacha hey, however, if all 3 didn't happen right over here, if you only saw one sighting on the night of this 8th day, and the other 2 on the next day, after you already entered the time when you could technically bring a sacrifice, these 3 do become combined as one. You have to bring a second sacrifice for this new flow. Why? Seemingly, even if you had only one, but you need the one to make the total of 3. And if this one happened at a time frame when you didn't become fit to bring a sacrifice yet, why should it count? Says the Rambam, anytime you have a first sighting of a zav, it's never considered to be a zav anyways. It's considered like semen. Only when you have the second sighting do you become a zav. So your status as a new zav only began over here. And that was a time when you were able to bring the sacrifice for the first 3 sightings that you had. Therefore, they become one unit. It's as if they all happened during the daytime. You got to bring a new sacrifice. When you see 2 more afterwards, it becomes combined for a sacrifice. But indeed, had you seen 2 out of the 3 on the night going into the 8th day, and only 1 on the 8th day, it's not going to combine, because you already became a zav at a time when you weren't yet fit to bring a sacrifice for the original ziva, and therefore you won't bring a sacrifice for this new, later ziva. Halacha Vav, that Rambam concludes the chapter with general rules relating to ziva. Hakel mistamin beziva, any man can become impure with the impurity of ziva. Afilu katan ben yema, even a child on the first day of his birth. V'hagedim v'ha'avadim, converts and slaves. V'chedesh v'shaita, even deaf mutes and mentally unstable people who are usually not under the rubric of many mitzvahs in the Torah. Here they could. It seems to me, says the Rambam, shemevian aleyan kaparah, that on these people, the last 2, deaf mute and the mentally unstable, somebody who's taking care of them should bring a sacrifice for them to allow them to partake in the future of sacrificial meat. It's a real sacrifice. Their sin offering could be eaten by the Kohanim. Like a child who has no mature mind. You could bring a sacrifice for a child, you could also bring a sacrifice for them. Impotent men, whether by castration, by human intervention, or by the sun, meaning naturally that's how they're born, still, if their organs produce these abnormal discharges, they can become impure like a zav, like any other man. A person whose genitalia is covered, or a hermaphrodite. We don't know what they are. We have to treat them stringently like men and like women. That means, mistamin bedam kenashim. If they experience blood flow, they become impure as though they're women. If they experience white discharges like a man, they are impure like a man. However, their whole impurity is doubtful. Therefore, if one of these tumtum or androgenes experienced 3 sightings of white discharge, notice that Rambam just uses the word sightings, because that's all that's important. It doesn't matter the days, as we saw yesterday. Or if one of them became or experienced an irregular blood flow, 3 days, because here for blood you have to have 3 days, one after another, mevian carbon, they have to bring a sacrifice, because maybe they're the right category, maybe they're a man, maybe they're a woman, experiencing this 3-time thing. But you cannot eat it because it's a doubt. However, this doubt leads to one leniency. Let's say this tumtum randregenes experienced 2 or 3 days of manly discharge, and they're counting 7 clean days for that. And during the 7 clean days, they experience a red blood flow, a womanly discharge. Or they had 2-3 days of womanly discharge, they're counting 7 days, and they see a manly discharge. The other color cannot get in the way or demolish the count, because they're mutually exclusive. If you're a man, we don't care about womanly discharges. If you're a woman, we don't care about manly discharges. Therefore, neither color can disrupt the count for the other color.